I'm Bertram de Souza, host of the Scribbler Publishing Group video podcast and retired editorial page editor and Sunday columnist for the now closed Youngstown Vindicator. Welcome to this special broadcast on guns. In March, Republican Governor Mike DeWine signed the permitless concealed carry gun law passed by the Republican majority in the Ohio General Assembly. This is in sharp contrast to the governor's introduction in October 2019 of the, quote, Strong Ohio, close quotes, bill, which called for a slew of gun reforms following the deadliest mass shooting in Dayton's history that year. According to the Dayton Daily News, DeWine's legislation died in the GOP-controlled General Assembly, and instead the governor signed multiple bills loosening gun laws. DeWine's transformation has gone unnoticed. My guest today, State Representative Jessica Miranda, the Democratic Minority Whip, has a lot to say about what's going on in the General Assembly and the governor's office with regard to guns. Representative Miranda is co-founder of the bicameral Gun Violence Prevention Caucus. Thank you, Representative Miranda, for joining me today. I know we've limited for time, so let me start with this. Despite opposition from Democrats, police organizations, public health researchers, and anti-gun violence activists, Ohio has now become the 23rd state to enact a permitless concealed carry gun law. What, in your opinion, will be the effect of this law on public safety and public health?
Yeah, so, this bill will actually allow any Ohioan 21 years and older to carry a concealed weapon without a permit and without any training whatsoever, which, as you know, is much different from the bill that we've had on the books here in Ohio since 2004, which, was modest, right? In everyone's opinion. It was only 8 hours of training to get your concealed carry permit, a full background check, and to make sure that you are not, on any kind of list and should not be carrying a concealed permit or a concealed weapon. So what this bill will now do is walk back years of safety measures that we have had in place for Ohioans to carry concealed weapons with a permit, right? And so what that literally translates to is what has happened in states like Arizona and Alaska. Our rates of crime and gun violence are going to skyrocket, as if they aren't already skyrocketing now with the rise in youth suicides, particularly that we've seen over the last 2 years in this pandemic. But in Alaska, if I'm not mistaken, or Arizona, their rates after they passed their version of permitless carry went up 17%. So if there's any, thing to be said about what's now going to happen in Ohio, it is for sure that our gun violence rates are going to go up by double digits, if not more. And the most important thing, on top of keeping our communities and our public safe, is this is going to put law enforcement officers' lives right in the line of fire and at risk more than they already are, which is why the FOP and so many other law enforcement agencies were against the bill.
And that brings me to my next question. Republican majorities in the House and Senate pushed through this legislation that was signed into law in March by Republican Governor Mike DeWine, who did not issue any kind of a signing message that is traditional when major legislation is signed. Since then, he has talked about how he's a strong supporter of law enforcement. However, it appears that the NRA and other gun rights groups have greater influence on the GOP in Ohio today than even the Fraternal Order of Police. Is this all about Ohio now being a firmly red state? Is this about politics? What is this? You're in Columbus. You were involved in the debates. You've heard the discussions. What prompted this legislation?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that the Ohio GOP has been overtaken and strong-armed by the gun lobby and those various groups that, as well as I do, roam around Cap Square and twist the arms of our majority legislators. And, the fact of the matter is I've met with the Ohio Buckeye Firearms Association, I believe is what they are still called, many times in my office, and have talked to them about what my thoughts were as a concealed carry permit holder myself, and someone who grew up. Yeah, someone who grew up in a house full of veterans. So we were, taught very, very well how to handle guns of various different types. But the fact of the matter is that Ohio didn't need this. In their book that they would carry around to legislators' offices, they would show us time and time again that Ohio was consistently rated either an A- or a B in their little rating system from A to F. So if Ohio was rated so very well, why are we continually making our state less safe with bills like permitless carry of concealed weapons and shoot first and arming teachers without training and, right? The list goes on and on. So I think, unfortunately, these outside influences and these special interest groups have gotten a little too out of control for the Republican legislators to bring them back into what the real issues are here in Ohio, which is not, your right to bear arms is not infringed.
But what struck me about this is the Republican Party has always claimed to be the party of law and order, and has always claimed to be the party of law enforcement. And
That's
yet, this, as you had pointed out, does put law enforcement officers on the firing line, in danger. Could you expound on that some more and explain why there is this concern that you have?
Absolutely. So, I prefer to rely on real world experiences of police officers, right? And we had many, many law enforcement officials and law enforcement groups like the FOP, like the Benevolent Association, that came in to testify against this bill and told us all the reasons why. It's going to put their lives in danger. It's going to make their jobs harder on a day-to-day basis. And, we already know that we lose several cops a year. One is too many, but we lose several cops a year responding to just domestic violence scenes alone, right? The Ohio Domestic Violence Network keeps track of this. We know these numbers. So one could argue, if we were really truly the party of law and order and we care so much about backing the blue, and every time the campaign year comes around, we're going to go across the state doing these back the blue rallies, then why in the world are we passing senseless bills like this that continually put our law enforcement officers' lives in danger? We are literally making it harder for them to know whether or not they're going to be coming home alive to their family at the end of their shift. And that, in my humble opinion, is absolutely ridiculous and so far from what they claim to be that it is oxymoronic in and of the sense.
The advocates and supporters of this legislation have pegged it constitutional carry and argue that this is, the Second Amendment rights, and that's all they're protecting. The constitutional issue, the issue of the Constitution aside, as co-founder of the bicameral Gun Violence Prevention Caucus, you've sponsored gun safety legislation. And in fact, Democrats offered what seemed to be reasonable amendments to the permitless gun law. Republicans simply dismissed such efforts. Is there anything that can be done to reverse this course that the GOP is on?
Yeah, we could get a fair map. We could really, get a redistricting process that, over 70% of Ohioans voted for, of which they're not getting right now. But I will say just, in short, to the beginning of your question, the reliance upon the constitutional argument as a rationale for this legislation in particular is unfounded, right? If there were a sound justification for this legislation, which there's not, it is not found in the Constitution, right? Because supporters' reliance upon the Constitution as a justification for this radical bill is nothing more than just a disingenuous pretext for dangerous policy that will make Ohio less safe, right? And make law enforcement officers less safe in that process. So it's, there's been case after case in the courts Our own Attorney General himself, Attorney General Yost, has said that our concealed carry permit process that we've had on the books since 2004 was working just fine. It was keeping guns out of the hands of people that don't need them or were looking to cause harm to others. And it was giving guns the proper way, in a safe way, to people who were going, to use them in a safe and in a sensible way. So all that to say, it is just another extremist piece of legislation that we are continually seeing again and again from the majority party in the state. And the only way to hold them accountable is to speak out and to speak up about the oxymoronicness of all of these bills, and to call them on their hypocrisy time and time again. And then, of course, if we could get a fair map, that would be great, so that we can hold some folks accountable at the ballot box.
To bring this issue home, Youngstown has consistently had one of the highest per capita homicide rates in the state. Indeed, there was one year that the city had the highest per capita homicide rate in the country, and that made national headlines. Gun violence increases as the mercury rises, and we're already seeing it. In fact, we're going to have the mayor and the police chief and members of council on to discuss this issue. In your estimation, given the fact that you have studied this legislation and you've studied what has happened in other parts of the country that have such laws, what's in store for a city like Youngstown?
Unfortunately, it's not looking good. I was not aware of those statistics from the city of Youngstown in particular, because, as you know, I'm down here on the southwestern tip of the state, down here in the Cincinnati suburbs. But, that statistic is alarming, right?
Yes.
And this bill allowing people to permitless conceal carry a deadly weapon without any checks on the violence they have in their background, or any checks, period, in terms of making our communities and our people and our law enforcement officers safe, is only going to lead to more violence, right? It's inevitable. And it's going to make cities like Youngstown, cities like mine here in Forest Park, cities like Cincinnati, and everywhere in between, less safe. And we've already seen it in state after state who has enacted these permitless carry laws. Their gun violence rates are shooting through the roof. And I expect nothing less to happen here in Ohio, on top of all of the other gun bills that were highly unnecessary that have been penned with a signature by the governor of the state.
Were you surprised that Governor DeWine, who after the Dayton massacre went to that city and talked about enacting laws to tighten gun possession, and red flag laws and all of those things? None of that came to pass, or the Republicans in the legislature would not go along with any of that. And there was a time, indeed, when he had early on indicated that misgivings about this law, but then signed it. Were you surprised?
I was surprised at first, but then I took a step back and looked at the entire picture, and realized that not only is it an election year where he was in a very tumultuous primary, he also is continually outrun and undercut by a legislature that has been overtaken by extremism, right? So it is, it's very difficult for him to do what maybe he knows is best, which I don't even know if he believes that it's the best, but it's hard for my Republican colleagues to do the right thing in their current political climate. And that is by no one's fault but their own, that they have allowed this kind of extremism to overrun and overtake their party. And it is, something that is, time is of the essence. In other words, they need to do something about this and to right that ship and right all of these wrongs before it's too late. And Ohioans' lives are literally at stake, and law enforcement lives are literally at stake because of it.
We did a podcast, a video podcast, previewing the primary election and then also a post-mortem on the election. And we had Brent Larkin and Tom Suttis, two veteran journalists, and I've known for 40 years. And they were the guests along with Dr. Bill Binning, who used to be chairman of the political science department at YSU and also at some point in his career, an insider Republican close to Jim Rhodes. And we were having a discussion about what was going on in Columbus, especially with the governor. And there was a point made that no one can recall when the legislature would so blatantly step on the authority of the governor as with the issue on the public health and the health department and their rules, where they actually took authority away from the governor. It's just, as you said, it is inconceivable what's going on with the legislature. So let me ask this, and it may be too cynical a question, but be that as it may. Could I suggest that there are a lot of Republican legislators who are willing to support such extreme legislation as this new gun law because the crime, major crimes, violent crimes are occurring in urban areas, in cities. And those people who live in those cities are not the constituents of these Republican legislators. So they don't really care what happens in cities like Cleveland or Cincinnati or Youngstown. Would that be too cynical a take on this thing?
Well, I think whenever we talk about the differences between, the geographic areas of Ohio, whether it's rural, suburban, urban, and everything in between, we need to realize that those gun violence rates are naturally going to be higher in urban areas because there's more people, right? You have more people, so of course the percentages and statistics are going to be higher, right? That is not to say, however, that these same violent crimes aren't happening in rural Ohio or suburban Ohio, right? The city where I live is the second largest city in my county here in Hamilton County. And we just had a father-son shooting last night in the early morning hours. And I could only imagine how much more frequent that is going to be with these bills that the governor has signed, like permitless concealed carry, like the shoot first bill, like the arming the teachers bill. And, that's also, your point about, it being higher in urban areas is also not including youth suicides, right? We have a serious problem on our hands in Ohio with the amount of youth suicides that have skyrocketed since this pandemic. And you know how children are getting a hold of those guns? Because they are unsecured and not safely put up in their parents' homes. The statistics show that every time one of our children commits suicide or finds a gun that is not securely stored in the parents' or a family member's home and accidentally shoots themselves or another child, it is because they are not safely storing their guns like they should be in their personal residence. So that's why Representative Kelly and I introduced House Bill 262, the Child Access Prevention Tax Credit. And we even went as far as putting a tax credit on it, right? To try to make this more palatable to my majority party Republican colleagues. If you don't think safe storage is a big enough issue for youth in this state, then perhaps this is a pro-business piece of legislation because it gives a tax credit to small business gun owners, as well as an income tax credit to Ohioans. So it's something that they typically would fall behind and be in support of, something like House Bill 262. But because of the rise of extremism and the huge influence the gun lobby has on them, and in their campaign coffers, they simply will not bring it forth for a second hearing. So all of that to say, of course, the statistics are going to be higher in urban areas because there's more population of people. The same violent crimes, especially youth suicides and, murders or injuries and domestic violence cases, not only to the people in that situation, but to our law enforcement officers being called to that scene, are going to skyrocket as well, as they already have been during the pandemic in suburban and rural areas of Ohio too.
So what do Republicans say, especially the sponsors of the legislation, when you put forth such arguments? When you propose what would be viewed as common sense amendments, where public health and public safety are priorities, how do these Republicans respond? Now, I know as a journalist, having covered Ohio politics for 4 decades, towards the end of my career, Republicans basically dismissed the media, the mainstream media. There was a time when I was able to, talk to Republican legislators and elected officials, but towards the end, they simply disregarded newspapers such as the Vindicator, and even the bigger papers like the Plain Dealer and all, because to them they felt that Ohio had moved in such a direction they didn't need, quote, the traditional coverage that they used to get. From a legislative point of view and from a legislator, how do they respond to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you've made. I mean, it is quite the scene in the State House when you are seeing your fellow legislators and colleagues running away from reporters, literally in the hallways of the State House. There is no accountability, right? Because of the gerrymandered districts that they represent, they cannot be held accountable, right? And what brews in those very gerrymandered districts is that the competition is only in the primary election. So the more extreme you are, the more radical and crazy you are, and the more you cause a fuss among the electorate and are screaming to the loudest minority of voters, the more sure you are to gain that seat, right? And then they come to the legislature and realize that things really aren't quite as they seem, but they have an image to uphold, right? They are part of the extremist uprising in the Ohio State House, and they have interesting values and interesting pieces of legislation that they want to see passed and enacted into law. And it flies right in the face of the very liberty that they are fighting for, right? Because liberty also means responsibility. And when you can't be held accountable in your elected seat, then there is no responsibility or responsible policy that is going to come out of your office or out of your district. So all that to say that I have a number of my colleagues who will tell me behind the scenes, when the cameras aren't around or committee's over and it's done live streaming, that they love the idea of that bill. They think it's great, but it'll never come back for a second hearing, right? Because they are beholden to the powers that be pulling the strings of which pieces of legislation are going to move forward and which pieces of legislation are not. And what they're doing is playing a very, very dangerous game because this is going to come down to more lives lost in our communities, our neighbors, our law enforcement officers' lives on the line, all in the name of extremist, senseless, and irresponsible policy that they think they need to keep winning those primary elections in their very, very gerrymandered district. So this is a dangerous cycle. And it is something, like I said, time is of the essence that we need to break this. And the most surefire way to make sure that happens is by getting fair maps. So
the bill goes into effect, if I'm not mistaken, mid-June. What happened, guys? It goes into effect in mid-June, right?
That's correct.
And so between now and then, as we were talking, the staff here and I were talking, a lot of the details have not been put out. And I think it would be, I think at the very least what the Democrats should do is put out the details of what this bill does. And if you do, we will willingly put it on our podcast just so our viewers can see what exactly this is going to happen. Finally, and I know we only have a half an hour and we're getting to the end. In the November election, the race for governor will, at least if the Democratic nominee for governor, Nan Whaley, has her way, will center on the abortion issue. By then, we will have known whether a woman's right to choose has been taken away by the U.S. Supreme Court, by the conservatives on the U.S. Supreme Court. Um, you have joined forces with State Rep Michelle Lepore-Hagan of Youngstown and others to put this legislation, to put a question on the ballot that would preserve a woman's right to choose. But there are already rumblings that there are going to be legislative attempts made to block this move. Could you speak briefly to that?
Yes. Well, again, it's kind of the sentiment of what we've been talking about this whole conversation and how it relates to gun violence and gun safety measures. The same is equally said for women's rights and women's rights to reproductive health care that fits the needs of their family, and where they can, listen to their healthcare professional.
Right.
And we already know that the overwhelming majority of Ohioans support access to reproductive health care, including abortion. The ability to control one's own body is not a partisan issue.
Right.
But for whatever reason, the GOP has made it their number one red herring partisan issue. And, it's funny, I tell this story all the time that I could be, at one of my voters' doors, because, I am one of those representatives that still does knock on doors,
Sure.
Believe it or not. There's not many of us that do, but by God, I do. And we'll be talking about 8 different topics, and we're in agreement, and we're seeing eye to eye. Our values match. It's fantastic. It looks like I'm going to gain their support on the ballot, right? Then, as I go to walk away, they'll ask me the question, well, how do you feel about abortion? And then I'll tell them my exact stance on abortion and that I believe government should have no say whatsoever
Right.
in a woman's right to bodily autonomy. And that one thing that has been ingrained into their thoughts as a member of the Republican Party and or, an independent or an unaffiliated person that seems to lean that way most of the time, that'll be it, right? It's the one issue that will turn voters against a representative, no matter how much sense you talk around the issue and about how actually what you've been told is not true. In other words, this is another very dangerous topic because we know it takes 3/5 of each chamber to pass this, to effectively put this constitutional amendment on the ballot for November. We know what we're up against in extremist Ohio, where both our House chamber and our Senate chamber has been taken over. But this is the right thing to do. I have folks in the Republican Party who identify as Republicans who have emailed my office, who have contacted me on Twitter and other social media platforms that tell me we may not see eye to eye. I'm pro-choice, they may be pro-life, but they also think it's a good move to put it on the ballot to let Ohioans decide, right? Put it to the vote and let Ohioans decide what they want to see in their state instead of federal law superseding state law or states' rights. And, unfortunately, bringing it back to states' rights, and then we're already overtaken by the extremist wing of their party
and
that we can't overcome.
There's nothing to suggest that Republicans, especially Republican legislators, want Ohioans to have a voice, just as they didn't want Ohioans to have a voice in determining how districts should be drawn, and didn't want to go to the people. And I think and when people talk to me about the issue, I'm a Roman Catholic, I say believing in a woman's right to choose does not necessarily make you pro-abortion. It just says we need to respect women enough to let them think for themselves, to know that they can make decisions as in their best interest and the interest of their families. And that seems to get lost in this discussion because it almost appears that the Republicans have successfully argued that if you give women a right to choose, she's going to go out and have an abortion because of convenience. She got pregnant because she went out partying with friends. Now she's pregnant. She just doesn't want to be pregnant. I mean, there is nothing to support that viewpoint, and yet that resonates, doesn't it?
Right, and that piece right there is so important, right? Because what you just said is the most important piece of every single bill that aims to take a woman's right to choose away from her in the legislature that's moving right now, including House Bill 598, right? One of my colleagues here in Southwest Ohio, Rep. Schmidt, just made a heinous comment about victims of rape and how rape can actually be an opportunity for women, which, you know, I have recently shared my very, very personal story with not only rape, but being a survivor of child sexual abuse. And that statement to me was not only personally offensive, but it was also inaccurate to all four corners of the state and how women feel when the time comes that they have to make these decisions, right? Because all healthcare decisions are very, very personal and should be left to patients and their doctors. And I shared a story on social media the other day of a woman who was bold enough and brave enough to tell her story about how she came to her third trimester and her baby that she was carrying did not have a fetal heartbeat. And the only choice she had, two choices she had, was to put her life in risk and try to give birth to this stillborn child, or abort that child per the advice of her healthcare professional in a safe and medical way to save her life. And, you know, that is a very, very tough personal decision that a woman has to make with her spouse and her healthcare professional. And how dare any one representative in a government setting, and, you know, from where I work, I'm going to speak on the state government setting, or the state government perspective, you know, aim to come in between that decision and put that woman's life at risk. You know, what are our values when we are so willing to put the woman's life at risk for the sake of a stillborn baby, right? It is absolutely insanity. And it is just, you know, that comment affected me on so many different levels, not only personally, but professionally as well, as a woman, that a fellow female colleague could even say something like that. I mean, do you say that to a 13-year-old who has been raped by her father and impregnated by her father? Do you say that to her? That it's going to be an opportunity for her to carry that baby full term and give birth to it, you know, an incest child? I mean, all medical issues aside from what that could do to a woman and or that incestual baby, let's think about the trauma surrounding that, right?
And also government's inability or failure to support, financially support healthcare, mental health care programs.
That's right.
Where these, as you say, where somebody who's been raped would have access to at least be able to talk to somebody, to share.
That's right.
Because many times in the home, there isn't that kind of family support system. And, and yet there seems to be blind to these realities.
Yeah, and keep in mind that all of these bills in this space that are being pushed by my extremist colleagues in the State House and the leaked decision by the Supreme Court of the United States has no exceptions whatsoever for those very heinous situations, right? No exceptions for victims of rape, no exceptions for victims of child sexual abuse and rape when it's interfamily. And so it just leaves...
And no exceptions for the health of the mother or the life of the mother who already has several children. What happens then? I mean...
and like you said, no further supports in the social systems that they need to make sure that not only their life, but that baby's life is one where they can reach their fullest potential.
We've come to the end of the time. There was a lot, and I do appreciate you spending this time with me and even going over. As I said to you, we are going to be doing a special live video podcast on the abortion issue. My co-host Cynthia Rickard will be leading the discussion, and I hope we will hope to invite you. I hope you will accept our invitation to join us, and at that point, perhaps tell your very personal story, because I think those are the kinds of things that people need to hear, as opposed to especially male politicians, white male politicians, sort of putting their spin on this very, very personal issue. So
absolutely.
So thank you very much, Representative Miranda. I appreciate it, and hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to our next discussion.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Once again, I thank State Representative Jessica Miranda for explaining why Ohio's latest gun law is not only a major public safety issue, but places law enforcement officers in harm's way. In the near future, we hope to have Youngstown Mayor Tito Brown, Police Chief Carl Davis, and members of City Council featured in a video podcast discussing the deeply rooted gun violence in the city. I'm Bertram de Souza, veteran journalist and host of the Scribbler Publishing Group's podcasts that are streamed on the Scribbler YouTube channel and Facebook page, WFMJ.com, and other platforms. Please like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell on our YouTube channel. These podcasts are designed to spotlight the important issues of the day. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost.